Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. This webinar, What Can You Ignore in Your Reserve Study, is designed to be a fun overview of what's important in a reserve study and what's not. In reserve studies by Association Reserves and by all other reserve study companies, there are some things that are absolutely important and some things that are just window dressing, suggestions or ideas for the future. If knowing the difference between the two is what you're interested in finding out, you've come to the right place. Now, I was challenged with this question, what can you ignore about your reserve study, by a friend, and my quick answer was, of course, everything's important. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I was wrong. There's a clear distinction between primary information and information that is just plain helpful. So that's what we're going to go today and explore that subject about what's important and what's only information or useful but not critical for helping you make a decision to provide for the future needs of the reserves at your association so projects can get done in a timely manner. Well, as Chris mentioned, my name is Robert Nordland. I've been involved in this industry enough years and done so many reserve studies that this is second nature to me. But for our clients and for other reserve study consumers, it's important that you understand what's important and what's not. Since this is a live webinar, if you've come with a question or if at any time in my presentation you have a question that comes to mind that I don't immediately answer, as Chris indicated, simply type it into the question dialog box, which is probably on the right-hand side of your screen in the webinar control panel. Chris will monitor those questions throughout the session today, and I'll address them at the Q&A time at the end. And now, let me try a little bit of live interaction to get to you comfortable with your control panel settings, because we're not in a room together. So show that you're with me and following along by clicking on the little hands raised icon. It'll look like what I'm showing on screen. Hands raised, everybody. Very good. Very good. Got a couple stragglers. Can you find the hands raised? Good enough. Okay, I'm going to do hands down for all. Thank you all. So, let's start at the very beginning. What are we trying to accomplish here? With a reserve study, here's some comparison slides just to get us on the right foundation. Here's good sidewalk, and here is bad sidewalk. Here's a picture of good tennis court, and here's a picture of bad tennis court. Hopefully it's very clear to you what the difference is. And along those lines, with a reserve study, how do you tell the difference between what's important and what's not? So you can get the information you need to avoid making the mistakes that lead to your common areas falling into disrepair, like those pictures that we just saw. It's inappropriate to guess. I don't want anyone out there guessing about what's important and making perhaps the wrong decision. There's so many directions you can go, and many of them, just as in this picture, are either in the wrong direction or are dead ends and wastes of your time. Board members are in the position where they're responsible to care for the assets of other homeowners. People who have effectively given over the keys to the care of the common areas into the board members' capable hands. And for managers, board members have hired you to help them carry out this responsibility. So it's something you shouldn't take lightly. This is serious business. Board members have a significant legal responsibility, and they have exposures, liability exposures. You can get in trouble if you don't execute your duties responsibly as a board member. So it's in the sessions like this one today that we're going to give you the tools that you'll need to make wise decisions. Today my focus is not going to be on numbers. We've done that in other webinars that looks like many of you have already seen. Today I'm going to emphasize two concepts. One is that of a pyramid, stressing that the foundation, the bottom layer, is critical before the upper layers are laid. The bottom layer forms a foundation. Upper layers are built on that foundation. And the second concept today is that of a traffic signal. It shows us when to stop and pay attention, when to proceed cautiously, and when to go ahead and safely ignore. So let's start today with the pyramid concept. Every reserve study has three parts: the reserve component list, the calculation of reserve fund strength, and the calculation of a reserve funding plan, or the recommended contributions towards reserves there at the association. We get this concept from National Reserve Study Standards, a document that provides us with common terminology, standard calculations, and a set of disclosures that are to appear in every reserve study. These standards were formed back in 1998, and they've grown in importance as reserve studies have become more commonplace across the country. Homeowners can move from one state to another, managers can move from one state to another, and they'll see the same key disclosures in their reserve studies, and in those reserve studies they'll see the same key words meaning the same things, and that's all due to National Reserve Study Standards. So let's start with that foundation, the component list. Per National Reserve Study Standards, items appear in the reserve component list if they meet all four parts of the following four-part test: that they are individually a common area maintenance responsibility, that they're life limited, that the project has a predictable remaining useful life, and that the project is above a minimum replacement cost. If a component appears on your reserve study that doesn't pass this four-part test, it should be removed and ignored. So as the foundation of your reserve study, the component list needs to be solid and reliable based on National Reserve Study Standards, period. The result of following National Reserve Study Standards is a reserve component list that will look something like this: a clear description of the projects to be done, a useful life in years, remaining useful life also in years, and a current replacement cost. The projects appearing in your reserve component list form the scope of your reserve study. A projection of those components into the future, inflated appropriately based on the inflation value in the reserve study, forms the schedule of your reserve expenses. Here I've shown the future expenses from that component list in the kind of chart you'll see in many reserve studies. And notice how the schedule is very irregular. It's not a stable pattern, and it's the kind of thing that almost looks random. So since the reserve component list is one of those critical elements, something you shouldn't ignore, and that's for two reasons. It forms the basis for the scope and schedule of your future reserve projects, and it's because the other two parts of the reserve study, the reserve fund strength calculations and reserve funding plan calculations, are based on this list. So the component list is critical information to stop and be careful of. The next key part of your reserve study is the calculation of your reserve fund strength, keeping you from worrying and wondering if your reserves fit the needs of the association very well, and if you have enough to accomplish your scheduled reserve projects. We don't want you or your homeowners wondering or worrying. You should know, and you'll find out in the reserve study. And this is done in two steps. First, per National Reserve Study Standards, the fully funded balance is calculated. It's a computation done for each component and summed for an association total for that fiscal year. Then the association's percent funded is calculated, where the association's actual reserve cash is compared to that fully funded total, multiplied by 100 to give you a result in terms of percentage. And this is what's measured. The 100% level is the bullseye, the middle of the 70 to 130% strong range, where the association has the same amount of cash in the reserve fund as they have deterioration of the reserve components. Weak reserves are when the association's in the 0 to 30% range, where there's relatively little cash compared to the common area of deterioration. And the fair range is in the 30 to 70% area, in between the weak and the strong range. And this is why knowing your reserve fund strength, specifically your percent funded, is important. You can see that there is a national profile of associations here, and to no surprise, the majority of associations are in the fair range. It's a nice stable profile across the country, with a minority on the left side in the weak range and another minority off on the right side in the strong range. And here's the implications. This is what you can learn from your percent funded. The lower your percent funded, the higher your association's risk of a special assessment that year. It's no surprise, really, because when your reserves are weak, you don't have enough reserve cash to pay for the scheduled reserve projects, and you're forced into either deferred maintenance or special assessments. And on the other hand, as expected, special assessments are very rare among associations with a strong reserve fund. And here's a summary. Special assessments are common among associations with a weak reserve fund in the 0 to 30% range. They're infrequent among associations in the fair range and rare among associations in the strong range. So National Reserve Study standards are a big help here, giving us a standard way to measure reserve fund strength and a standard way for managers, board members, and homeowners to know their risk of an upcoming special assessment. This is, again, critical key information that's important for you to know and not ignore. And now we get to the question of funding your reserves. It takes a lot of money to provide for your scheduled reserve projects, even to just barely skim by. But the important question is, how do you decide? How much of your hard-earned money and that of your neighboring homeowners are you going to set aside? You've probably heard terms like straight line or cash flow, or even heard debates of the pros and cons of each of these two primary reserve calculation methods. The point I want to make here is that you actually have choices. It's not one answer. If you've hired a reserve professional, that professional will probably have a recommended calculation methodology or a recommended funding objective, or they might provide you some options. The point is that there are options. There is no one right answer. There's conservative, safe strategies and risky, aggressive strategies. With respect to reserve funding, you have choices. Let me show you what I'm talking about. While the range of typical reserve contributions for an association's budget is somewhere in the 15 to 40% range, I'm going to illustrate this point with a typical association that's setting 25% of their budget towards reserves. What I need you to understand is that, again, you have choices here with respect to reserve funding. National Reserve Study standards define a reserve funding plan that barely covers the scheduled reserve expenses, inviting some special assessment risk as being called baseline funding. Those same standards define a funding plan designed so that the reserve deterioration is matched by reserve cash in the bank is called full funding. And among our clients, the difference between the two is relatively minor. Just 3% of an association's total budget. Not a big deal. So the difference between a conservative reserve funding plan and an aggressive reserve funding plan is just a few percentage points as part of total budget. So if an association tries to trim their reserve contributions too much, more than just a few percentage points out of total budget, what happens? Well, there's real consequences. You run out of money. And what happens when that happens? The scheduled necessary reserve projects don't get done if a special assessment doesn't get passed. And well-intended associations who hope to have enough reserves for their scheduled reserve projects end up with rec building bathrooms that look like this, neglected for years because the board kept not quite getting around to funding the renovation. Real consequences, again, built on the foundation of the schedule of reserve projects appearing in your reserve component list. So your reserve funding plan is another important part of your reserve study. You'll find a little more flexibility here, so I've shown the check mark in orange, not red. But still, your reserve funding plan is one of the 3 key results from your reserve study. And now let me ask for a hands raised here that you're understanding the concept that in your reserve study you're going to get these 3 key issues, and they form the foundation for your reserve study and are not to be ignored. Hands raised if you're with me. Great. Okay, I'm going to put hands down. Okay, now we'll move on to the concept of the traffic light. When do you take action? When do you stop and wait? And when do you proceed cautiously? Here's that same sample reserve component list that I showed earlier. If you can read the numbers, you can see that the first component has a remaining useful life of 0. One of the other components has a remaining useful life of 1 year. Down to the building repaint project here. The question is, do you or should you execute a reserve project that your reserve study says is scheduled to occur when the remaining useful life hits 0? Let me illustrate with this slide. 2 dogs, but very different. That's why I need you to begin to think with your reserve study. Just because a reserve project has a 0 remaining useful life and is scheduled to occur doesn't mean you automatically treat them all the same. They're different and should be treated differently. And this is where we can begin to think about what can we ignore in your reserve study. Here's an actual schedule of reserve expenditures from a reserve study. This one is shown with the years in columns from left to right across the page, and I've circled the 2 projects that are scheduled to occur in the initial year. They have a 0 remaining useful life. So the question is, does the association jump and get those projects done? Here's another way you might see reserve project assignment list, and this is another company's format where reserve projects are grouped vertically, going down the page year by year by year. And here's yet another format where the reserve components with the remaining useful life of 0 are all highlighted. Now, what do you think about this association? Lots of deterioration, lots of projects for the board to address. I hope they have enough reserves. It seems like they've got a busy year ahead of them. But the question is, do they need to do all those highlighted reserve projects this year? They're all with a remaining useful life of 0, but do they need to address them? So let's think about that. Let's identify the types of reserve projects that you'll see as board members and managers. The first types are inconsequential projects. These are projects like a pool heater, clubhouse heater, or air conditioner, or perhaps the hot water system in the clubhouse. They're common area assets. The association is responsible to maintain them. They have a defined useful life, predictable remaining useful life, and a replacement cost that's significant to the association. They appear on the reserve component list. But just because they appear as needing to be replaced and they have a remaining useful life of 0, do you automatically transfer the money and do the replacement? Well, the answer is no. it's quite possible to ignore the recommendation to replace. You see the green light on this page. Watch these components and keep moving forward. You need to realize that they've reached the end of their economic life or the end of their service life, and they could fail at any time, but I'd recommend that there's no reason to replace these types of components before they fail. So for inconsequential components, wait and replace them after they fail. Ignore the recommendation in the reserve study to be proactive. The next category of component is something we call reevaluate. These are components like roofing and fencing. Significant components. They fit the national 4-part test for appearing in a reserve study. But again, when the remaining useful life hits 0, what do? Do you just go ahead and replace the roof or replace the fence? Well, our recommendation is to not completely ignore, but keep an eye on them. Kind of yellow light, caution, reevaluate them. And if they're still serving the association well, you can delay the project a year without a problem. So the issue is reevaluate and carefully, cautiously delay the project a year. And there's a third of 5 categories. What we call these are projects that fit into the obsolescence category, where failure is due to becoming obsolete. Components in this category are things like an access system. The variety ranges from a keyed access system, maybe a hardwired buzzer system, a telephone entry system, or maybe a video or proximity card system, or maybe something like the clubhouse furniture, or maybe building signage, or maybe just the main sign outside the association. Failure here does not really mean the asset has broken. It just means that it's old. And again, the idea here is to not completely ignore. It's yellow light, proceed with caution, but understand that if money is tight and you have other priorities, you can delay the project until next year. Just don't make delays a habit, or you'll get into a significant deferred maintenance problem. Another asset category is that having to do with protection. And I say this carefully because I'm not talking about security, I'm talking about protection of the asset itself. There's some projects like wood paint that protects the underlying wood from the elements. And the same applies to deck sealing or asphalt sealing. These are projects that help extend the life and appearance of the association. If these projects are delayed or undone, the association will face the expensive consequences of rebuilding or replacing. So these are protection or shell type projects. And our recommendation here is, if you've been following the pattern, notice the red light on the page, stop. Stop, pay attention, and execute. When the remaining useful life of this type of project hits 0, do the project. You might be tempted to see that the paint still looks okay or the decks still look okay, but that's generally foolish. Stop, do the project, and find that you're extending the service life of the expensive underlying asset. If you wait until this looks poor, until the deck is cracked or the wood paint is cracked, you've waited too long and you're already damaging the underlying expensive component that's underneath. And the final category of projects that we've divided your association assets into is those that we call the catastrophic category. And these are projects like the central hot water system for a building, balcony railings, or a driveway gate motor. Failure of any of these types of projects will lead to some significant inconvenience, perhaps safety, as with respect to the balcony railings, or it'll significantly lower the security at the association. Catastrophic projects will be felt by all at the association. And again, our recommendation is red light. Stop, Pay attention and execute. When a catastrophic type component shows a remaining useful life of 0 in your reserve study, stop, get bids, do the project, and move on to other decision points. Doing these types of projects should not be things that you have to stop and think about. It should be just automatic. Okay, outside the component list, reserve fund strength, funding plan, you'll find a number of other types of information in your reserve study. Some are key, meaning that they're important, and the key things that you want to care about and let jump out are things like knowing and understanding your reserve study type. There's one of 3 National Reserve Study types that you should have in your hands: the full update with site visit and the update no site visit reserve study. So understand your reserve study type. Second is reserve study date. You should know and care whether your reserve study is for the current year or if it's for 2 or 3 or more years ago, which means the recommendations and the findings are old, out of date, and not much use. And another key piece of information is the funding objective. Funding objective is a required National Reserve Study Standards disclosure. The reserve study is to clearly tell the reader whether the objective of the reserve funding plan is to be conservatively full funded, or if it's an aggressive baseline funding objective, or somewhere in between, which is called a threshold funding objective. If the reserve study shows multiple objectives, each is supposed to be described in these standard terms so you can understand and make a wise choice about what plan of action to take. And then next in your reserve study, you'll find some good, interesting information. It's not critical. It's not that important that you know it, but it's information that makes a reserve study complete. It's no big deal if you can't pick these numbers out of your reserve study. These numbers don't individually help you make decisions. One is the number of reserve components. It's interesting to know the number of components, but only so you can see the hopefully minor changes from year to year. And then measurements. Measurements are important for your reserve study professional, or perhaps for a vendor that you're asking them to give a bid for repainting the ironwork. It's nice to know that there's 735 lineal feet at your association, but it's not something that you need to memorize or be able to quickly find. It should be in there. Actually, it's required to be in there. And similarly, the fully funded balance is critical to calculating your association's percent funded, but standing by itself, it's just an interesting number. What's really important is that you compare the fully funded balance to your actual reserve cash to get your reserve fund strength. That's that percent funded number. That percent funded number is critical, but not the fully funded balance all by itself. And then the future cost. Future costs is information that needs to be in your reserve study so the funding plan can properly account for and prepare for those changing costs into the future, but hopefully that's all done through your funding plan. What you care about is making sure the costs in the component list, the foundation, are complete and accurate. Knowing and finding a clear list of future costs scattered through the years, not so important. And finally, what can you ignore? One pet peeve of mine is something that we see a lot, and it's the total dollar value of all reserve components. Since your reserve components will never all need replacing at one point in time, it's kind of a meaningless number. You'll never have to come up with this amount of cash. And since many or most components don't age chronologically in a nice manner from year to year, if your reserve study shows the age of a component, it most likely will need to show an adjustment so they can get to the truly important number, and that's the remaining useful life. It's nice to know the installed date, but the age, not so important. And then allocation of cash to each component. That's close to meaningless. Reserve cash is reserve cash. You don't actually have roof dollars or paint dollars or elevator dollars. You have reserve dollars. So if reserve study shows an allocation of your total reserves spread among each component, don't fret. You don't have to match that. And that doesn't have to match anything that you've set aside on your own. If the funding plan shows you'll have enough money, that's what's important. It's typical that your reserve professional will rebalance or reallocate this distribution of funds each year as part of their reserve study presentation. So don't put too much stock on that distribution. It's mostly just for curiosity's sake. And finally, an old reserve study is an old reserve study. It's current and useful a few years ago, but by now it's out of date. Don't take recommendations or findings from an old reserve study very seriously. What we want you to do is have power. We want you to be a superhero at your association, knowing what information is important, what is meaningless information, and with your super skills, you'll be able to totally leap right over or see right through that meaningless information. We want you to be board members and managers of great associations, paying attention to what's important, taking care of the common areas, and maintaining property values, not getting distracted by things that don't matter. And so with that, I'll conclude the formal portion of my presentation and turn the floor back over to Chris and have her act as moderator for the questions that you've typed in during my presentation. Chris?
Thank you, Robert. As I mentioned earlier, you can ask Robert a question by typing your question into the box at the bottom of your control panel. And we have a couple of not so much questions as statements here. Leonard